All right, I guess we'll get started here. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, so I'm sure you guys already know about the change. I'm sure Jessica could let you guys know that there was going to be a bit of a change, a bit low, nay? How's that? Is that a little better? Okay. So there's a bit of a change. As you guys know, Jess, well, maybe you don't know, Jess had her baby. So she's now on maternity leave, and I've taken over a course for the next remaining part of the semester. So that'll take us right up to the final, which is great because there was a nice logical break, everything just kind of lined up good. So there was a nice logical break, your reading week, obviously, and then now we're into the next half of this. So my name is Sean. So I've been teaching at Georgian it'll be 6 years in September, so 5 and a bit. 5 and 2 semesters, or 5 and a semester and a half, I guess. This is going to be my last semester for a little bit, though. I'm going to take a bit of a break just to do some more self-learning, and which is always important, periodically. I just started a new role at a new job, so I definitely want to be able to kind of skill up a bit for that. So I'm not a full-time professor. I'm a part-time professor, or part-time instructor, actually. I do work full-time in the industry, though. So I work for a company called LMG, which stands for LabX Media. I started with them as a senior software engineer, and now I am a technical project manager. However, I've been a senior software engineer for about going on 4 years, and then obviously before that I was an intermediate, and before that I was a junior, and way before that I started at the same place you guys are. So I had started at Georgian College and learned, well, kind of knew stuff beforehand. I just went to kind of get the paperwork so I could start working in the industry. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell, right? Super quick little download of who Sean is. So what we're gonna do, I'm going to kind of follow, it's going to be kind of a hybrid of Jess's course and my course, so I hope that's okay. The Tune Share thing that you guys were building before, I don't think we're going to continue with that just because it's Jess's code and I'm not sure where we're going with it. So instead we'll probably just do what I generally do, which is a small condensed lesson, each lesson that encompasses one idea. Okay? Just because that's easier. I'm also teaching another group at the same time, so it's a little bit easier for me to kind of correlate all 3 groups at the same time. I'm also teaching JavaScript too. Not that you guys have JavaScript this semester, but you will in a couple of semesters. How was the co-op thing back then? Oh, co-op was weird. So I didn't take computer programming. I took I took computer programming, just not computer programming, the course. I took the web animation and design course. Believe it or not, I was actually in the same program as Jess. We were in the same program. We even did a project together. But yeah, so I took web dev back then. Finding a co-op was a struggle, a huge struggle. I completely lucked out because Georgian College had an internal marketing company called Treefort, and so I managed to get a job with Treefort, but it was not paid, right? It was entirely voluntary. And then I also did some hours with a client that I had just had a personal client that I worked with, and did some hours for them as well, and the school said that was good enough for a co-op. Jess, though, I think she did Gel Creative, and there was a position for Gel Creative, but like I said, we were in web, and we're going back 7 years, almost 8 years now. It was a little easier, actually 9 years. 9 years. It was a little bit easier to find the co-ops because there was a bunch of web companies in Barrie, and we were a small group. We weren't nearly as large as you guys are. You guys have a massive group of people. It is trickier for you guys, also looking for co-ops in your field is tricky because I know many of you aren't even looking necessarily for web co-ops. You're looking for, working with Java and stuff like that. So you're looking at banks and large corporations and things. And right now with COVID, finding co-ops are very difficult. It's very, very difficult. That being said, though, don't just rely on your co-op department to help you with that. What I would definitely do is apply to jobs on Glassdoor, Indeed, Monster, ZipRecruiter is another one. 4 great resources for looking for jobs. Stack Overflow, yeah. Also, just do a search, like a Google search for web development companies in Barrie or programming in Barrie and stuff like that, and then go and just apply. Go hit their contact forms and send your resumes or send a reach out kind of just saying, hey, are you looking for anybody for a co-op? Incidentally, LMG, the company I work for, periodically does hire co-ops. We just filled our position, though. But I know in the summer we'll likely be looking for co-ops again. So I'll keep my ear to the ground, and if any come available, I'll let you guys know, and then you guys can apply for those as well. We're a large company. We have over 150 employees, and we're constantly increasing that. So yeah, we're a very, very big company. All right, cool. Let's take a look at what we're going to learn. So last week, from what I understand, not last week, sorry, not even the week before, because you guys did you have a midterm in this course? No? Okay, so we did a midterm, but okay, so you guys didn't do a midterm, so that's fine. So not last week, but the week before, you guys did your search lecture. So I know that she has it in here that she'd like to recap on the search lecture. I'm not going to recap just because I don't know what you did. But suffice to say, I think you guys basically implemented like into MySQL for doing fuzzy matching. Or wildcard matching, I should say. Which is entirely a cool thing. So I'll just do the same thing that I did with the group prior to you. And I'll talk a little bit about other search systems that are out there and kind of why we don't really implement search in applications very much anymore. Instead, we use a search service because it's a little bit better that way. We don't necessarily not use like, though. We will use like for things like filtering data or not sorting data, but we use it to filter data. So that is a concept where you would use the wildcard option, right? So that you can filter down your data list. However, a lot of that tends to happen on the front end, and you tend to filter it using like JavaScript libraries and stuff. So I don't know. Anyways, we'll talk about it in a second. So this week we're going to talk about form validation, sanitization, and normalization of user data. So that's taking the data that comes from your forms or your user inputs and then basically taking that data and turning it into something that is pure, that you can put into your database, right? That you don't have to worry about it being contaminated with any noise, we'll call it, right? So hackers trying to hack you with like SQL injection, cross-site scripting type stuff, or even just bad data from users who have just happened to enter bad data, right? So we're going to take a look at that tonight. But first we're going to cover some things. So I did this cool things, and because I did the cool things, I ran out of time. So I'll leave the cool things for you guys to explore. Basically, it's just covering, different resources for learning HTML and CSS, resources for learning PHP and JavaScript, as well as some cool little readables that you guys should take a look at, talking about client-side validation and how that works in the browser using the built-in API that Chrome and Firefox and all them provide you. So yeah, there's just some of those. So we're going to skip that. Week 7 review, we're just going to glaze over that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other search options that are out there that are like search as a service or software as a service. And then we're going to get into form validation, where we're going to do some sanitization, normalization. We're also going to do some client-side validation. So the first part of tonight's lesson will be client-side, and then the second part of the lesson will be working on server-side validation. So yeah, lots of stuff. So, learning objectives, so developing scripts that validate form input on the server. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. It doesn't say this, but we're also going to take a look at the browser API that actually we can utilize in order to create a better user experience for the user when they're actually interacting with our form, right? So client-side validation, we're going to call it. So like I said, you guys can look at this cool things on your own time. We're going to skip through that. So you guys did this search and you implemented it into your TuneShare in order to basically search for any of your songs, right? And you guys were using the like clause, yeah, for doing wildcard searching. All right, so in the industry right now, like for example at LMG, we don't use our own custom search, like we don't build our own searches. The reason being is because there's a psychology behind search, right? It's not just necessarily going and finding every record in the database that matches cat, for example, right? Instead, what you would want to do is match articles that not only necessarily match cat, but also match concepts that are related to cat, like pet or allergies, right? Like an allergy or medication for cats or health for cats and stuff like that. There's a lot more to what you're trying to match than just the word cat. So there's systems out there that are provided that actually create a better way to do search, especially in large-scale systems. So for example, at LMG, we have 6 article brands and 1 e-commerce that we're getting another one, and then so we're getting another article brand as well. So we have 2 e-commerce and 7 article brands altogether. These article brands have up to 40,000 articles in some of them. I think actually some are even more than that. One of the companies that we have that we're working with has over 20 million users every day, like 20 million users a day accessing this website. And because of that, you need a system that can handle that kind of growth, as well as also handle what people are actually contextually looking for. So in our system right now, we use something called Solr, S-O-L-R. And what Solr is it's a search service that you attach to your database. It scans your database and categorizes it, and then builds out basically a giant map, so that when somebody types in a search, it can actually map to the correct data that person would be looking for, based on context, based on inflections, based on a lot of different information, using machine learning, right, in order to be able to build that out. So Solr provides a very fast way for people to access data and be able to search data, especially in large data systems. In our other product that we have that I can't name right now because I don't think we're public about it. I don't know. I'm not going to say it though. In our other product that we just acquired, we're using something instead called Elasticsearch. Elasticsearch works similarly to Solr. It's provided by AWS as a service that they have, but you can roll your own Elasticsearch service, so you can create your own virtual machine or whatever you want to do, your own box, set up your own Elasticsearch service, and then connect it to a database, and then the same thing applies. It scans the database, creates correlations between data, and then makes it so that when a person does a search, that it's able to contextually provide the best result set based on what they're searching for. So search is kind of an interesting thing. Rolling your own search actually gets pretty sophisticated. It's actually a very difficult thing to create. Do these products use related search info from other platforms like Google or Facebook? Yes, sometimes yes. So sometimes you can actually implement other search platforms into your search systems that can provide a broader range of search so that you can actually pull in external resources. But if what you mean by that is whether or not we pull the algorithms that are used from Google or Facebook for their search systems, no. However, Facebook, their search system is likely Elasticsearch, more than likely. I'm betting dollars to donuts that it's likely Elasticsearch on the back end. Google, however, has their own search system, right? Because they do their own search algorithm, and it changes all the time. But I think they are active contributors to some of these search products like Solr and Elasticsearch for being able to broaden this whole system, right? However, AWS, because there's such a huge Amazon, like the storefront, definitely uses Elasticsearch because that's one of the services they offer. So they use Elasticsearch in their system, right? So a lot of these companies use those services but don't necessarily provide to those services. Yeah, search is kind of one of those crazy things. You don't think it's so complicated, especially when you're like, hey, I can just type in like, and I can access, all these things. But when you think about, the thing that you want and the information you're looking for, it isn't as simple as a one-to-one match or even a fuzzy match for that matter. Usually you want something more contextual, just like what Google does when you type in, should I dye my hair blue? Google has to take that question and then try to interpret what you're trying to ask, right? Are you looking for dyes that dye your hair blue? Or are you looking for the reasons why you should or shouldn't dye your hair blue? So it takes that into effect. It depends. So the compensation model varies. With AWS, it's based on data size. So it depends on how big your database is that it's indexing. It's not based on searches. I don't think it is. I might be wrong, though. It might be based on the number of searches per hour. But I'm pretty sure it's only based on data size. So depending on how large the data set is how much you pay, right? Solar, we roll our own solar system, so we have our own solar service. So it's just the amount of data that it's consuming that we're paying for. It's just based on its size. There's some other services, like, I don't know if it still sticks around, but Google used to provide a search service that you could connect to your website. And what essentially would happen is Google would index the pages of your site and then kind of try to come up with a decent search system. And then you would plug in their search, like an API, and people would use their search, and then they would get a search page with your pages on it, right? And it would tell you which pages closely resemble what you're looking for, but I don't know if Google still provides that. They used to do it. They did it like 15 years ago. I don't know if they still do it now. And it was pretty cool. All right, so that leads us into form validation. And what is form validation? So, form validation, when you enter data, the web application checks to see that the data is correct. So when we're saying web application here, we're actually not talking about the back-end application. We're talking about the client. So the client, the thing that sits on the front, the browser that you're using, or it doesn't even necessarily have to be a browser. A lot of people don't realize, but like Steam, where you go and use your games, that is a client. Origin is a client. Epic is a client, right? The Netflix app on your phone is a client. Crave is a client. Prime is a client. Those are all clients. And what they do is they communicate with your server. So a client communicates with your server, okay? Clients are generally not safe. They're not protected. There's no way to guarantee their security. You can't guarantee the data that's coming from it. You also can't even guarantee the data that's on the page, right? You can't make those guarantees because clients are not stateful. They're stateless. They can constantly change. So you're not in control of that, and you always need to be aware of that. So the same applies when we're talking about data, when we're talking about form validation. We don't want to rely on the form data that the user is sending to us because it could have modified, it could have changed in transit, and it could have changed even while they were on the page and they were unaware of it. So form validation is generally the helpful little things that you get when you fill out a field and then you click submit and you've done something wrong, right? And then the form comes up and draws your attention to a field and says, hey, you need to fix this field. You entered incorrect data. So you go and fix that field, and then you hit submit again, and it points out another problem that you have. That whole experience that you're having isn't for security. It's actually for your user experience. It's to create a better user experience. Because if we didn't have that validation on the form itself, when you click submit, it would do kind of a round robin. It would go back to the database, or sorry, to the server, and the server would validate it and go, hey, you're missing your name here. You need your name. And then it would come back with a message saying, hey, you're missing your name. So you click your back button. That takes you back to the form. You fill out your name. You hit submit. And then it's like, oh, come on, man. You're missing your email address. You need the email address. So you click back, and then you fill out the email address, and you click submit, and damn it, nope. Still nothing because you forgot some other piece of information. That's a terrible user experience. That whole concept of those multiple steps, fill out field, click submit, click back, that's too many steps for a user. It's much better to click submit, have your focus automatically pulled to the field that you've messed up on, and have to repair that field. That's a good user experience. However, it is not securing your data, right? So for something like a game anti-cheat, is that just a lot of form validation? So anti-cheats are kind of, it depends on what you mean by anti-cheat. So if you mean built into a game where you're actually moving your little character around and the anti-cheat system in the background is running and verifying whether or not you're cheating, That's not form validation. That's a bit different. They're probably running something else that's listening for... To me, if I was to build an anti-cheat system, I would look for other processes that are running on your system while you're running my game, right? And I would go, okay, well, what processes are you currently running on your system while you're running my game? Oh, hey, you've got, Bob's gear stubber or whatever, Bob's gear buffer, right? And I see that you've got Bob's gear buffer running as a process, and I go, oh, you're definitely cheating. Or your anti-cheat system your cheat system is actually making requests while you're playing my game, and it's making requests from my game. Then I can actually look at those requests that you're sending out and also likely determine that you're cheating. So, or if the game's bytecode gets modified, that's common. That's also true. So they can look at they can take a look at the bytecode. There's a thing, I forget what it's called. It's not MD5 checksum. It's checksum. They can look at the checksum and be able to tell whether the code has been modified. And if it's been modified, then they can reject it, because most of these games where you're doing cheating in will actually modify the files inside the game. It'll either modify DLLs or it'll modify config files, XML files, whatever they have running in the background. And then if it modifies those files, they can detect that. Yeah. In WoW especially too, because they're likely throwing... WoW's weird because when you cheat, a lot of cheaters, what they'll do is they'll create a bot that moves the character. Right? So they'll create a bot that actually gets the character to move around and go collect gold while they're doing something else. And that's kind of an interesting idea. So that's more along the lines of automation. That's harder to track. That's harder to beat. Just because that usually runs locally on their machine, and it's not like reaching out and making requests or anything. So now they have to look at the actual... Who's creating this user input? Who's actually, is it the mouse that's creating the input, or is the input coming from some other source? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because we talk about validation from a web aspect, but validation actually exists throughout everything we do, right? So any type of application development that you're going to do is going to involve validation of some sort. Even if it's not even necessarily for security reasons, but just to verify that the data you're getting is correct data, right? Like, validation is such a common thing that you need to have in order to build any type of program. Cool. So why do we need to validate? Well, validation, whether it's on the client, where we're actually validating inside the browser, or whether we're validating on the back, is for the same reason. We want to ensure that we're getting the right data in the correct format, right? That's our awesome goal at the end of the day. No matter what we're trying to do, we just want to make sure the data is correct, right? So when somebody's filling out their name, it's in the correct format, not necessarily name so much, but their email address, right? Like, yeah, your email address needs to contain an @ symbol. It needs to have a domain. It needs to have a top-level domain, right? Stuff like that. Like, it needs to have those specific details. Otherwise, it's not a valid email address. And that's important, because if you're collecting email addresses for like mail, right? Like email, like you want to send them a notification, or you want to send them, maybe they're a part of a mailing list and you want to be able to advertise or something like that. You need to rely on the fact that email address is in the correct format. That doesn't necessarily mean the email address exists, though there are ways to make sure that happens too. But it does at least does guarantee that it is getting into the system in the correct format. Another big reason why we validate specifically for the server is to protect our users. So one common thing that a hacker can do is inject JavaScript into a database. And the way they do this is, let's use, I did this in the last class, let's use WordPress as an example. WordPress has a comment field on a post, right? So Johnny Hacker comes along, fills out the comment field, and enters in a script inside there, a little JavaScript that essentially dumps the cookies from a user and sends it to an API, right? Or they load in a script, which they can also do from a remote address. They load in a script that runs a whole bunch of stuff against a user, grabbing cookies, grabbing any session data, stuff like that, and then sends it off to somebody else so they can hijack their session or steal their information, right? Or even just keylog, right? Just sets up a keylogger so now they can log every key that the user strokes. So Johnny Hacker has put this into the comment field. Hit submit. This gets into the database as a raw script, right? So it's sitting in the database as a raw script. User comes along, goes to read the post. It loads the comments up. When it loads the comments up, the browser's stupid. It doesn't understand that this script is an actual JavaScript you want to load. It just goes, oh, that's JavaScript. So it renders it in the background. Nobody can see it, and it starts running in the background. Now that script can go ahead and perform whatever malicious duty it wants to perform. So how do we stop that? Well, we stop that by when anybody submits anything from a form, we sanitize it. We rip out any script tags. We go through and make sure that what we're left with is just basically string data, and that's it, and that it can't do anything maliciously or execute in any way. So that's the idea. That's protecting our users. And then we also want to protect ourselves, right? We want to make sure that the user isn't submitting like SQL injections, right? So they can do a SQL injection, hijack our database, grab all the data from our database and download it to themselves. That's essentially what happened to Target. They hijacked their database, unloaded all of their data, and all of it was raw, right? Raw text files. Not raw text files, raw passwords, like raw text passwords. And what they can do with that information is often a user will create multiple accounts across multiple different services using the same email and password combination. So even while they may not want to access, Jessica's blog, they do want those passwords and logins informations to go and access that user's Netflix or Amazon account or Facebook account or banking account or whatever they can possibly access with those details. So it's very important to protect ourselves, protect our users, right? Overall, and it's simple as just validating, sanitizing, and normalizing data as it comes in. That's all we need to do to make sure that everything stays purified. If the existence of an email can be checked, then can it be considered as a privacy threat, or how is it taken care of? So we can't actually check that the email exists for sure. We can send an email to it and listen for a bounce. If it bounces back at us and says, hey, this email doesn't exist, then we can go, okay, cool. But that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist. An email server that actually is hosting emails counts, right? If I have a domain like a hotmail.com, for example, and I try Kevin6943 at hotmail.com and I send an email to it, it won't necessarily bounce. It might go somewhere. Yet it might not actually go to a person. What could happen is the email server takes in the email, says this doesn't exist, and dumps it. But it doesn't bounce back for that exact reason, right? So for the exact reason that it doesn't want to let people know that this email doesn't exist, it just wants to basically kind of sweep it under the carpet and pretend that it handled it, right? The way we get around that, and you've seen this, is when you sign up for a service, it sends you a confirmation email. And then you click the little link inside the confirmation email saying, yep, this is a valid email address and I am a valid human being. And that goes off to their systems. That's how we check the existence of a valid email address. By kind of manipulating the user a little bit. Does that make sense? Yeah, no worries. All right. So how do we validate? Well, there's two types of validation. There's client-side validation and there's server-side validation. Like we mentioned with client-side validation, it's really not protecting anybody or anything, right? Does nothing. It means squat altogether. But what it does do is provide a good user experience. It allows the user to be able to know that something is wrong with the data they're entering right away without having to go to the server and come back, go to the server and come back. They get that instant feedback that, hey, the stuff you entered is incorrect, please correct it, right? Server-side validation is not an option, right? People are like, I've got client-side validation. I'm okay. I don't really need server-side validation, do I? The answer to that question is always yes. Yes, you do. You always need server-side validation. If you're taking data from the user, you need to make sure it is valid data. I say this all the time. Don't hate the user. Don't take this as me hating the user, because I don't hate the user. But all users, in my mind, when I'm coding an application, all users are either hackers or dumbasses. They're one of those two. Never fail. So either they are going to hack me and completely steal all of my stuff, or they're so dumb they're going to insert data that just doesn't make sense and contaminate my database. So they're one of those two people. And by living my life acknowledging that users are like that, I don't wind up with databases or servers that have fail points, right? I mean, nothing's 100%, but I'm at least sitting at a 99 most times, right? I'm at a 99 because as far as I'm concerned, any user using my application is either trying to hack me or is too stupid to use the computer. So that's basically how I split it up. I realize that that's not the case because many of you are not hackers, and yet many of you are very intelligent people, but that's not the point. You're not who I'm worried about, right? I'm worried about those two users, so I need to program based on those two users, right? So that's done by client-side validation, which kind of helps my dumb user who doesn't know how to fill out a form. What's my name? I don't know, right? That helps them be able to fill out those fields correctly. And then my server-side validation kind of deals with my hacker who's like, haha, I'm going to send post requests to your server and bypass your form altogether. And you won't be able to catch me. And he's got that, crazy curly mustache, and he's tying hard disks to the railroad track and stuff, right? Like that guy. That's the guy I'm circumventing. That was quite colorful, now that I think of it. All right. Is client-side validation enough? Answer that for me. Is client-side validation enough? Absolutely. No. No, it is not. It is not enough. Ha! Maggie Mullen. That's funny. I know who you are. I got asked today if I knew a Maggie Mullen. I guess you sent in a thing to LMG a little while ago and we were talking about it. That's funny. Hi, Maggie. So is client-side validation enough? Absolutely not. No, it is not. It is not enough whatsoever. What's the problem with client-side validation? Well, validators are not foolproof, which we just talked about. But this wonderful thing that Jess outlined is absolutely 100% true. Tools like Postman. Well, what's Postman? Postman allows me to send requests, HTTP requests, to a server without going through a browser, right? So I don't even have to open my browser. I just send my request. So I can send post requests to your server and I can send get requests to your server, right? Because I have that capability to do both of those things and send those things to you, I don't have to worry about your client-side validation at all because it's never going to affect me. I'm never going to encounter it. Other reasons, I can turn JavaScript off. Boom. Goodbye, client-side validation. There's no JavaScript, right? Or I can even just add a little attribute to your form called no validate, and that completely null and voids your whole validation on the form if you're using the browser's validation. So no, it's never ever foolproof whatsoever. Relies purely on HTML5 validation. That is 100% true, and it won't always work. That is also true. It's also not reliable from browser to browser. Just keep that in mind, that browsers are the ones responsible for implementing these validation APIs, and they differ depending on the browser you're in. So the way a validation works in one API won't necessarily work exactly the same way as it does in another API. And you can test that by taking a form that you've applied attributes to for validation and open it in Chrome, open it in Safari, and open it in Firefox and run a test across those three browsers, and they will definitely all interact differently. I said Bowser. I meant browsers. Thinking Mario. But they will all interact differently. And if you don't believe me and you're on Windows, open anything in Chrome and then open it in Edge or Internet Explorer, and you'll see how they kind of function differently. So we're not going to do this. We're not going to add it to our TuneShare application. What we are going to do is we are going to implement we're going to create a brand new application. So what are we at? 737? Oh yeah, by the way, next week we're doing APIs. Let's go to... I have to back up. Okay, here. So we are week 8, March 17th. So if you can access that folder, which is under your Module 4 folder. And under Code Examples, you will find starter files. Click on that, and we will download the starter files. Now I'm going to apologize for the zip file. I still haven't figured out compression very well inside. Brain just stopped working. Just shut off entirely. Compression working inside Windows. I seem to have an issue with it. Yes, I do. I have an ultra wide. Don't worry, I'll be zooming in on things to make it a little easier to see. Actually, I have 2 ultra wides. I like it better. I used to have 4 monitors, and now I have 2 ultra wides, which works a lot better. Once you've downloaded the file, just go ahead, right-click, choose Extract All, or if you're on a Mac, do it that way. The archiver or whatever it is you happen to be using. Yeah, it can be. It can be. I still feel like I'm a monitor short. It just depends on what I'm doing, because I have logs on one screen, and then I have Jira tickets on another, and then I've got code in one, and I'm talking to somebody on Slack. I've just got too many things going on, so I often need like a 3rd, 4th, 17th screen in order to keep up with everything. I want to be like the architect from The Matrix and just be surrounded in screens. That would be wonderful. Once you have your starter files, go ahead and open them up and just keep diving down in those folders till you see these wonderful files in here. Is there a way to increase the size? Oh. I can increase the thumbnail, but I can't seem to increase the actual file size. Oh, that's cool. So it's just scroll till you scroll backwards, and then it all becomes nice and big. So these are the files we're looking for. I'm not sure what you guys are using in the way of your web application, right? Like your what's the word I'm looking for? Your Apache server and PHP and MySQL thing. I'm using WAMP. I imagine some of you are using WAMP, some of you are using MAMP, and perhaps 1 or 2 of you are using XAMPP. I even have somebody in the other class using a Raspberry Pi with a custom web server. And another guy using a Docker. Yeah, Scott. That's who it is. And Attila's using the Docker. Yeah. So I imagine most of you guys are using WAMP, MAMP, and maybe 1 or 2 are using XAMPP. Yeah, Docker's a good thing to know. Like at LMG, we use Docker for our rollouts. So like whenever we're doing a deploy, it's always deploying out to Docker containers. We can use them locally as well, though, and do web development with Docker containers locally, too. And a lot more companies are using Docker because it just normalizes everything, right? It doesn't matter if you're using Linux, Windows, or Mac. It's the same environment inside the Docker for all 3. That's why people like Docker. All right, so I'm using WAMP, so I'm going to navigate to my C directory. And then I'm going to go find my WAMP64 folder. I'm going to look for my www directory. And I'm going to create a new folder in here. You don't need to create this folder unless you want to, but I'm going to call it comp1006 Thur. Or sorry, no, you're not Thursday. You're Wednesday 03. So I'm going to put all of my lesson folders in here so that way I can keep them nicely separated from the other 2 groups. I'm going to create a new folder, and this is something I would like you to do, called Lesson 08. And then once you have that folder, I want you to take these files And if you hit Control A, they'll all be selected, and you can either Control X to cut them, or just drag them over and drop them. So now those will be in my web server directory. If you're using XAMPP, it hides them under htdocs. If you're using MAMP, I think it also goes into htdocs. I can't remember. I can't remember where you hide them. I haven't had a Mac in 2 years now. I use Linux at work. I don't use Macs. htdocs? Okay, yeah. So then htdocs. After you've done that, if you have VS Code, I don't know what IDEs you guys are using, but I use VS Code. I right-click in the folder, the web server folder, and I choose to open with code. And then that will open up my folder inside my IDE. So I've been watching Jess's videos, and she uses phpMyAdmin. I like to use MySQL Workbench. I don't really like to use phpMyAdmin. However, how do I get a clean split screen? So I hit the Windows key, right? And I hit the cursor key to the right. And then that pops up, this docks this screen to the, like this window to the right, and then gives me the option to choose what I want docked on the left. So it's Windows key and a direction. Yeah. Talk about paying it forward. I had a student teach me that like 4 years ago, or 3 years ago. That's super awesome. You can also drag a window to whichever side you want. Yes, that's true too. So you can always like just drag it till the cursor kind of hits the edge, and then you see how it's kind of lit up gray, and then you let go and it docks. And you can also like stack them into quadrants too. So you can have like 4 all docked as well. And then the cool thing is it should, as you drag this out, it auto resizes the docked window. See? So for example, I don't need a giant browser window, but I do need a giant IDE window. Absolutely. All right, so like I was saying, when we took our SQL and actually applied it to the MySQL, I used Workbench, and everybody was like, yeah, let's use Workbench. And then there was about 4 people, I think altogether, maybe 5, that had to go and actually run it inside phpMyAdmin, likely because they're running multiple MySQL servers somehow, and I didn't want to go down the road of trying to fix that. So if you're not confident using Workbench in this class, then just don't. But if you are confident, I'm going to be using Workbench. From what I understand, though, you guys have written enough databases to use at this point that you should already be fairly comfortable with creating a new table. So I have provided you a table, and we're going to create this table in the database called database. Whoops, why am I getting in a min status? Oh, right, because I don't have a connection. So it would help if I opened up the WAMP server. So I'll open up WAMP so that I can actually access MySQL. Yeah, I know the database course uses Workbench, and they said the same thing, but then they were having issues getting, basically getting their WAMP or MAMP to actually communicate with the database that was being used in Workbench, which I didn't understand how. You can have multiple MySQLs running at the same time, but they have to be on different ports. That's the only thing. So I'm not sure how they would have had 2 like that, but I have seen it before where one runs and then the other one is in like its own process container. It's weird. Anyways, it didn't make a lot of sense, and I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole of trying to fix it. So I'm going to open up Workbench, click on my little fella here, zoom in. Ta-da! Senior size. And I'm going to close this off. Don't copy this yet. And I'm going to go to my tables, and I'm going to drop my table. Cool. So we're going to create a new table. If you look inside your IDE in your list of files, you'll see contacts.sql. Just go ahead, hit Control-A, Control-C to copy that. And then I double-click on the database, and it does this kind of nice dark, like it basically bolds it, so that way I know that this database is in use. I click on a new SQL file. But if you are concerned you're not writing to the correct database, you can type in use database, right? Which will use this database. So this is not database as in a database. This is database as in this schema's name. And then you can paste in the rest of it. Did I do this wrong? Ha! I bet you I have to quote this thing. If you have to quote it, you can do it with ticks. So the back tick is underneath your escape key. And then if you click the little lightning bolt, it will use this database, and then it will create a new table. And if you hit the refresh button, there's our contacts table. So just while you're doing that, I'm just going to run through the contacts table. Super simple, nothing very difficult. It's an auto-incrementing ID column, right? We have an fname field that is a variable char of 20 characters or less, and it's not allowed to be null. We have an lname field that's a variable characters of 20 characters, and it can't be null. An email field of 30 characters and not null. And then an age and a URL fields, and both of them can be null. Age has to be an integer of no more than 3 characters, and the reason that is because I don't think there's anybody over 1,000 years old that's going to be a contact that we would have that we would be able to reach. And the URL is 50 characters or less, which might be too short considering, you know, some URLs have a lot of extra characters, but I'm thinking like a portfolio or like a LinkedIn profile, right? Which should be under 50 characters. Cool? Alright. One more step we need to do under the connect.php. I've only made one small change here. I've enabled error handling. And the reason I enabled it is because PDO will throw an error when you go to connect if your connection is wrong. So it will throw an error for that. And you'll get the error and you'll be able to solve it. However, if you go to submit a SQL query, right? If you go to execute a SQL query and there's an error in the SQL query, it won't actually output the error. Nothing will happen and you have no idea that nothing happened. Which is kind of like, I don't know, it kind of feels like poor design a little bit, but that's just how it works. If you want it to output the error, you have to enable the error mode exception so that it actually produces the error. It is very frustrating, especially when you're a student just learning. Yeah. Because, I mean, SQL errors and nothing's happening and you have no idea why your data is not going into the database. Yeah, you definitely need this to know why. Oh, one other change. You can tell this is coming from somebody who does Java. There. I like these when the curly braces are on the same line. This is... You can tell I'm a script kiddie, because that's what script kiddies do. They like to put curly braces on the same lines. Do it in JavaScript, do it in PHP. Is that how you tell? Yeah, that's how you tell. They put curly braces on the same lines. Those are script kiddies. Alright, so the other thing you may need to do is, if you're not using a database called database, make sure you change that. If your username is different, change your username. Can you guys read this okay, or do I need to zoom in? It's good? Okay. If you have a password, add the password. I know those of you that are on Mac likely have root, right? Root is your username and root is your password. So make sure you update that. some point we'll create an environment file, and all that information will be in an environment file, and then we'll pull it in from the environment file. All right, so let's just make sure all this is kind of working. I'm going to go to my browser window, and I'm going to navigate to the site. So if I go to localhost, I should see the WAMP server load up here, right? And if you're on XAMPP or something like that, you should still see this. Now I need to navigate to that URL. So mine is under this comp-1006-Wednesday-03 folder. And the reason I know that, and hopefully you guys know this stuff too, is if I look at this directory, the www directory, the C:/WAMP64 www is already being interpreted by the word localhost. Okay? Because what's happening is Apache is actually taking, when we type in localhost or 127.0.0.1, and mapping it to the www directory for us automatically. Okay? So this is mapped to this directory, the www directory. So when we go here, it will be in here. The reason why you don't see folders though is because we have an index file, and the Apache server will automatically load the index file. If there's an index file in the folder, it gets loaded. Okay? But I need to be in this directory, the comp1006 directory, so I have to add it to my local host, right? And then when I hit enter, because I don't have an index file in here, it will actually load any of the directories that are in there locally. It shouldn't do that if you're on a live server, if the live server has been set up correctly. It should give you a 404 or something like that, or a forbidden. And now if I click on lesson 8, I will see this contacts page. So hopefully you guys see the contacts page. And then the last step of that, I'm going to click Create New Contact, which is going to take me to my contact form. And this is where we're going to work after our small break. All right, so what we'll do is we'll take 15 minutes, and then we'll power through this. We'll power through the other part, and maybe we might end early, he says, optimistically. We might end early. I don't know. We'll see. All right. If you have any questions or anything's broken, I can help you right now. Otherwise, feel free to go have 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So we'll meet back here at 7:10. All right, so I guess we'll start back up again. So what we're going to do first is actually implement form validation inside our client-side form. That's going to be our first step. So like I said, this isn't going to give us any actual security. All it's going to do is provide a very nice user experience for our end user. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to bring up my... I'm going to quickly explain through here how this form is actually coming into existence. If you open up your index.php, sorry, not the index.php page, I'm wrong, the new.php page, this might be a little different than what you guys have done up to this point. I think the other class explained to me that you guys were doing new and edit from one page. We're kind of doing that, but what we're doing is we're surrounding these pieces in the new.php, but our form itself we're importing in, right? So we're requiring our form, including it into our page, and then rendering it. And the reason why we're doing that is because we're going to use the same form not only for the new, but also for our edit.php as well. So it's going to do double duty. Kind of the same that you guys did, except for it just means that our form is not on one of these actual pages. It's in its own file by itself. Okay, so hopefully that's pretty straightforward. So The form itself right now, we do have this field here. It's a hidden field. If I detect an ID, then I'll actually load a value for that hidden field. We're not going to deal with that right this second. I don't know if you guys know about code folding, but this little bracket here, you can actually click it and it kind of folds up the code. All right. So the first step is we want to figure out what kind of validation we need on the front end inside our client that's going to benefit our user into understanding what data it is that we want to look for. So one of the first things that we need right off the bat is the fields that we require them to actually fill out, right? And that's a super important thing because they need to know what fields to fill out in order for them to give us that data. Yeah, Control plus, Andrew, will actually make your font larger. So Control plus and Control minus makes it smaller. Can you guys read this code okay? Do I need to make it larger or is it a good size? Yeah? Okay. So the easiest way to tell what we need in the way of validation for our fields and what fields are required is to actually look at the database table. The database table will tell us exactly the things we require inside our form. So if we open up this contact SQL that I gave you, inside this table, we can actually tell which fields are required. And the way we tell that is by looking for the not null. Not null means it can't be null, right? It has to contain a value. There has to be a value. Otherwise, it's going to cause a problem. It's going to blow up and throw an error. So that's fine. So we know that F name can't be null, L name can't be null, and email cannot be null, right? All three of those have to have a value inside them. Age and URL, however, they can be null, so we don't need to worry about those two. So let's go back to our form, and we'll make it so that these three fields are all absolutely required, and the person has to enter information into them. So the easiest way to do that is to just add the new attribute, it's an HTML5 attribute, onto the end of our input element here that you see here, our input tag, and it's just called required. That's it. Nothing special. Just required. Now if I save that and I attempt to submit this form, it's going to work because I didn't refresh. I need to refresh first. Now if I submit, we get this little box that pops up saying please fill out this field. That's Chrome's wonderful little validation kicking in and telling us, or telling the end user, hey, you can't leave yet. You can't submit this form until you fill out this field. If I was to put information in the field and hit submit, sure enough, it goes on to wherever it's going to go. You'll notice we have this little stray greater than symbol. That's because it looks like I left a value in here accidentally on line 13. Feel free to just take that out of there and then it will go away. See, now it's empty. So we're going to apply this required attribute to the other two fields as well. So we'll add required and to the email required. And then we'll hit refresh. So now if I hit submit, you're going to notice that it still just points at the first name. It doesn't actually tell us anything about the other two fields yet. So I fill that in, I click submit. Nope, I got to fill this one in as well. Click submit. Nope, I got to fill in email as well. Click submit, and then finally it actually posts. So one way we can provide a better user experience for the user is to let them know that these fields are required by indicating in some way that they're required. So the way I like to do that is I just add an asterisk on the label. So that's first name, and I'm just going to put an asterisk at the end of it. Same thing with last name, and same thing with email. So now with those asterisks, you can kind of tell something is different about these fields. I mean, we're implying they're required, hopefully that the user understands that they're required, but that's what we're going to offer. We're going to offer that. So that's cool. We have our three fields. This is a good user experience. They know which ones are required. They're not going to submit it unless those fields have actually been filled out. That's a good question, Andrew. That actually leads to another scenario, right? So one of the other issues that we have is that these fields kind of just allow anything to be shoved in them, right? Like I can add ASDF into first name. That's fine, right? It's just a string. ASDF into last name. Okay, that's all right. I mean, that's a crappy name, but whatever. ASDF into email, but wait, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not an email address, right? That's just ASDF. ASDF into age. Okay, now things are just getting ridiculous here. No one is ASDF years old, right? And ASDF as a personal page. I don't recommend putting that onto your resume. It would probably not be a good idea. And then if you click submit, oh, yeah, off it goes. So it totally accepts that. So there has to be a way around this in order to stop them from entering incorrect data format in these fields. And there is. And like Andrew just pointed out, we can actually change the data types in order to do that. Yes, Harmon, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. You're not supposed to see your data yet. So if I click my submit form, there is no data yet. We're not doing anything with the data. So right now the form is just the form. So when you submit it, there will be no data. That's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. So the email address, we want to change it so that the email is looking for the correct email format, and this would actually throw an error if we were to add ASDF. So the way we do that is under input type text for the email, we're going to change this to email. So now the type is an email type. I'm going to refresh my browser. ASDF, ASDF, ASDF. I can actually leave these fields blank. I don't need to actually populate anything in them. Click submit. Oh, please include an @ in the email address. ASDF is missing the @ symbol. All right, well, there's your @ symbol. Submit. Please enter a part following the @ symbol. Okay, there. Oh, it actually accepted that. That's interesting. That's interesting that it accepts that and doesn't require the top domain. All you need to submit is @ASDF, ASDF @ASDF. That's pretty funny. Maybe you don't need top level domains in all email addresses. If that's the case, I didn't know that. Now with age, I can enter ASDF in here as well. And it actually takes it, right? And that's not a good user experience either. We don't want ASDF in there. So what's the best way to work on that? The way to work around that is by forcing age to be a number. So in the input type text, we're going to change it from text to number. Now when I refresh, if I hover over, you see these little symbols here, I can actually add a number. Yeah. Yeah, that, I guarantee that's true, actually, yeah. When you use any of the filters, the PHP filters, whether it's filter var or filter input, you would 100% need the top level domain. Yeah. Yeah, so it's weird that Google lets it pass. Because this is Chrome, right? They're the ones that built the API for this particular validator. So the last one is the personal page. Right now I can type in ASDF in here and it will work. We want to make it so we can't do that. So the best thing for us to do is change its data type to URL. Now we've got a fairly robust form, right? I can ASDF, ASDF, ASDF. I can't ASDF there anymore, but I could do 1, 2, 3, 4. And I click submit. Boom. Need an @ symbol. All right. @ASDF. Submit. Nope. Must enter a URL. Okay, well, how about asdf.com? Will you accept that? Nope. Must be a URL. So likely need the schema. Submit. Boom. There we go. That is the minimum data required for us to be able to submit our form. So that's all fine, but we can actually kick it up an even like a bigger notch, right? We can kick it up a notch and we can actually force the user to do more things, right? We can actually put more validation in to support them. So for example, if we look at our SQL table here, we notice that our varchars actually have limits in them, right? So a maximum of 20 characters on the L name and first name, right? We also have a maximum of 30 characters on the email. The age can only be up to 3 characters long. And the URL is a maximum of 50 characters. So we can actually implement those constraints into our attributes. I don't think age or page required though. So the user doesn't need to enter them correct. That's correct. So if they don't put anything in these values, this form will still submit. It's just if they put something in here, it has to be in the correct format. All right, so for the F name, we're going to add a new attribute called max length. And we're going to make it equal to the character restriction limit inside our F name for our database table. So it's 20. We're going to do the same thing to the L name field as well. Whoops, I didn't mean to hit enter there. Max length equals 20. So now this does something weird. If you were to type in something longer than 20 characters somehow, I think it would let it go through. But what it does is it actually forces the field itself to stop at 20 characters. I can't type more than 20 characters. Same with the email. I can only get up to 30 characters long. Oh, this is letting me just put as many as I want. Oh, right, because I didn't add the max length to it. Let's add the max length to email, which is 30. Then try that again. And you see it's locked. I can't go past that point. So I can add these in, add these in, add these in, and we'll just leave the other one. See, it takes it now, but I haven't exceeded my limit because the fields themselves don't let me exceed the limit. They have a maximum of character count. The only bad thing is, though, is that the user can't keep typing in here, but it's not giving them any notice to why. So they have no real feedback saying, hey, this is a maximum of 20 characters. So you probably would want to add some sort of notice under here saying like a maximum of 20 characters. Now, I think Bootstrap actually supports something like that. You can do a small. I forget what it looks like, though. Hold on. I didn't do this with the other group, so I don't know this off the top of my head. Let's go to Forms. Overview. This thing right here is what I want. So it's called Email Help. So we're going to create one of those. It's just a div. Actually, I'm going to try a small because I like smalls. So we can write it like this. Small dot form text, like so, and hit tab, and then Emmet will fill it out for us. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar to working with Emmet, but we can say max length 20 characters, like so. What does that give us? Yeah, that looks nice, right? It would be better if I spelt length right. But yeah, that works, right? So that gives them more information. That's a good user experience. So now they know that as they type, why it's stopping and they can't type further because they have a max length of 20 characters. So why don't we copy that and we'll add it underneath the input for L name, and then we'll add it under email as well, but we'll change it to 30 characters. Boom. Look at that. That's a very lovely looking form. So age is less than 3 digits. Yeah, that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is, now that it's a number, we can't actually put a max length on it, Andrew, because max length only applies to text-based elements, like text-based inputs. But what we can do is we can set a max restriction that they can reach in numbers, like a numerical value. So we can say, I looked it up on Google earlier, and the oldest person alive is 117 years old. So we'll give 130. We'll be optimistic that they'll live at least another 13 years, right? We can also create a range by giving a min as well. So if we wanted to, we could say only people 18 to 130 can enter their age in here. Nobody else can enter their age in there. Just those people. So now if we enter in a value, right, we can say 9, and we can fill these things out as well, and hit submit, and it says the value must be greater than or equal to 18. So we kind of force that, and if we were to try to enter in, say, 135, the value must be less than or equal to 130. So we kind of have a control, a restriction of what they can put in. However, the only thing we can't control is them doing things like 56.7. Oh, interesting. Actually, we don't accept decimals. It restricts it. That's pretty cool. I didn't actually know it did that. So we should give information about that as well. And just say something like, age must be between 18 and 130. So that gives nice information. They have all their information, right? It's a good user experience. Yay us. Look at us caring about the user. Now the personal page has to be in a URL format, but we should also provide the length of the URL. So the length is equal to 50 characters. We don't allow our URL to exceed, sorry, that should be max length, not length. Max length is equal to 50 characters. And we should add in this little form text block as well, because it does provide such wonderful information. And we'll just say the same thing as we said before. Max length 50 characters. Right? Boom. That is nice. Look at that form. That's a gorgeous looking bootstrap form. You can totally tell it's bootstrapped too. So what I'll do is I'll create a paste bin, because I know sometimes it's hard to keep up. And I'll paste this code into the paste bin. Oh, I did that wrong. I can put syntax highlighting on it, but I really don't feel it's necessary. Create the new paste. There you go. There's the paste bin. And I'll talk while you guys are sorting that out. So, our form, wonderful, right? We're actually providing a decent user experience, right? I can type in my name. I can type in my email address. Actually, you know what's funny? I think. Oh, look at that. 30 characters is not enough. I can't add the .ca, but I don't need to, because it turns out it passes, right? But I would need it for the other one. So I'm going to have to do asdf@asdf.com. That kind of sucks. To fix this, I would have to alter my database table to at least 50 characters. So age 42, and personal email page or personal page is seanmckinnon.ca. There we go. And if I submit this, yay, everything goes through. And the good news is I can't actually submit dumb data, right? Like I can't submit ASDF or it throws an error, right? I have to have the actual proper URL. I can't even throw this out unless I go way over. I could do that, right? But it has to be between the range, so 42. And this thing can't be ASDF as well because it's going to tell me to enter a URL. So we have a wonderful user experience here. It definitely protects us, right? We're controlled here. But here's the problem. If I wanted to pass dumb data that I'm not allowed to pass, all I really have to do, right-click, choose Inspect, go find this form, literally just click anywhere on the form, and type in no validate, and hit Enter. This flag basically tells Chrome to shut off its validation features. So now I have an improper email address, I have an improper personal page, and I can click Submit. And none of the validation has kicked in. because no validate has disabled the validation for us. So as you can see, in a way of protection, like a first, I don't know, if you wanted to say it was like the first level of defense, it's not. It's really not at all. It's not any defense. To me, it is useless defense. All it is really for is a good user experience. Other than that, you're getting no actual validation value out of it. Make sense? Cool? Clear as mud? I don't know how I wound up on the OpenGL page. Let's try that again. There we go. So that's cool. So we have all these values in here. We have all these things protecting us. That's awesome. But when they submit this form, it's going to go off into the Netherlands, and then we need to actually do proper server-side validation to guarantee that we don't have bad data, right? That's our whole responsibility. We don't want data coming to us that contains hacks, that contains cross-site scriptings, that contains data that's irrelevant or in the incorrect format. We want to make sure all of that is proper. So we're going to do that next, and we're going to do that in the process.php page. So go ahead and open up process.php. Actually, before we do that, let's do ourselves a favor, just because we want to be able to submit this form without having to meet our client-side validation. So let's just, in our form up here, we'll add a new flag or a new attribute called noValidate, and we'll save it, right? So now that form won't validate on every submission. In fact, it won't validate on any of them. So just add the noValidate attribute to it, and now this form can be submitted. So if I hit refresh and hit submit, as you can see, it just goes. We don't have to worry about it. So our form is pointing at process.php. This is a little different than the way I've built these before in the past, but I will agree that this is a better way to teach students just because it's a little simpler. Usually I separate concerns so that if you're creating something, I send you to a like an insert script, and then if you are updating, I will send you to an update script. So we may modify that in future lessons, but for now we'll just leave this as one big process.php page because that's what you guys have built before. So I want to keep along that pattern so you know what we're doing here. Okay? So there's a few pieces that we're going to do here. I have brought in the header and our connection script and the footer. Hopefully, I ran out of time and we weren't able to actually do the CRUD operations for this. We only got the validation done. We didn't actually wind up writing anything to the database. Hopefully we'll get to the point where we can write to the database because we are running a bit better on time than I was in the other course. But we'll see. So the first thing we're going to do is do some sanitization. That's our first step, sanitization. And the way we're going to sanitize our data is we're going to use filter input, but then we're going to use the sanitizer for all of that. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So $ID equals filter input, input post, which actually grabs the posted value and then evaluates it. We're going to look for the fname key in that posted data. And then we're going to pass another piece here which allows us to actually sanitize the data as we're pulling it out. So I'm going to sanitize this as a string. So what that will do is if the user puts anything inside the string that isn't supposed to be there, sorry, that shouldn't be a string, that should be an int. My apologies. No, it's number int is what it is. There we go. That's better. If the user was to put something in there that isn't a number, what will happen is ID will wind up as an empty field or null, right? And that's kind of our way to be able to tell if the user is editing or just inserting, because that ID field will either contain a number or it will be blank. And if it's blank, then it will just wind up getting set to null. The max number of digits for IDs or the max number of digits in general. I mean, we could do that. We can validate that the ID is no more than 11 characters long, like 11 numbers long, but I'm just going to let the database deal with that one. The database will throw a rejection if you try to enter in an ID that's longer than it's supposed to be. But keep in mind, we don't actually create the IDs in the database, right, Andrew? That gets auto-incremented, right? So the IDs in the database are automatically incrementing and creating themselves. The only reason why we would need an ID is to do a lookup. And if they give an ID that's like, say it's 17 numbers long, then it's going to fail anyways, because there's no way we would have a row inside the database that was 17 numbers long, right? So it kind of takes care of itself, so we can kind of avoid having to deal with that. All right, so for first name, I'm going to call it F name. I didn't do this in my notes. I called it first name, but I kind of like to keep things the way they are. I'm going to do filter input post again, right? I don't know why I said F name here. That should have been ID, not F name. Sorry about that. It's been a long day. This is F name. And this time we're going to filter sanitize string. So now I'm a super lazy programmer, and I don't like having to type the same thing over and over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm just making sure my cursor is on this line. And if you're using VS Code, you can hit Alt, Shift, and down, and that will duplicate the line downwards. Other IDs, sometimes it's Control D that will duplicate the line. And then if I double click on F name, it only highlights F name. And just on this row, I'm not clicking on the row above, just the row below, right? But it does kind of highlight everything. But you'll see that I have a blinking cursor there. If I hit Control D, it selects the other one as well. So now I have two blinking cursors, and I can type in L name at the same time. Save myself some hassle. I'll hit Alt Shift down again, and this time I'm going to do email, so I'll double click on L name, hit Control D, type in email, but this time I'm going to filter sanitize the email address. So I'm changing that to filter sanitize email. Yeah, it's super handy. Absolutely. And I'm going to Alt Shift one more time, and this one I'm going to do is the URL. So I'm just going to hit Control D. I don't want to hit Control D too many times, or I'll wind up selecting this email as well. I type in URL, and then I'm going to change this to URL with uppercase letters. And then age, the way I'm going to do age is I'm going to come up here and click on right beside the ID. I'm going to hit Alt Shift and down, and it's going to duplicate it. Now I want to move it in my list so that they're in the same order that I get them in. So I'm going to hold down Alt, not Shift, and just use the cursor key to bring it down. You can go in both directions, up or down, right? But I'm going to bring it down. And then I'm going to double click on ID, hit Control D, and change that to age. Learning how to use your IDE will make you it won't necessarily make you a better programmer, but it will definitely make you a faster programmer. So let's see what this sanitization actually does. So if I enter in no data and I hit submit, I still get a blank page. I have no idea what's going on. But what I can do is actually var dump those values. So I don't know if Jess showed you this, but you can actually dump them all out by just doing comma separation. And it will actually put them each on an individual line. So there I go. I've var dumped all of them out. And if I hit refresh and continue, I can see all of my values here. So right now they're all empty, and that's because we literally passed nothing, right? So if I come back and change this to Sean and McKinnon, and I do asdf@asdf.com, and I give an age of 43, well, I'm actually 42, let's not date myself higher, and asdf.com, there we go, and I hit submit. Now I've got values here, right? I wind up with these silly scroll bars, but I've got some values that you can see. And everything is past the sanitization check. So let's break it, right? I mean, what's the best way to do this stuff? We got to break it. So I'm only going to pass ASDF as the email address. If I hit submit, the weird thing is the sanitizer doesn't actually ensure that it's in an email format. What sanitize email actually does is it's just an alias for sanitize string. They're the same thing. So why you need one called email, I don't know, because it doesn't do anything. Same with the URL. If I break the URL and I hit submit, I just get back ASDF. It doesn't actually convert it or nullify it or anything like that. But where this comes into play is if I'm a sneaky person, and I know I have 50 characters here, I'm going to write a script tag, alert, you have been hacked. Boom. I just hacked you. And I click submit. This gets passed and this will get sanitized. Right now it's being converted into a string literal. So this is not executing at all. That actually makes me ask a question. Hold on. If I echo $URL, that will actually output it as a proper script tag. Yeah, so that sanitization is doing literally nothing. So then I would actually argue, sorry, kind of learning this on the fly, I will actually argue that you change those to sanitize strings and don't use sanitize email or sanitize URL. Use sanitize strings. And the reason being is because now if I refresh, notice I get no hack. This alert you've been hacked doesn't actually execute JavaScript. Instead, if you look at what it's done, it's removed the script tags and it's replaced the quote characters you see here with HTML characters. Yes, I know that. Yeah, we're going to do validate secondly. So that's kind of good to know. So I would use filter sanitize and filter sanitize numbers, strings and numbers, and that's it. And don't try to get fancy using sanitize email or sanitize URL because it doesn't seem to do squat. So once we have our data sanitized and we've safely removed bad data, our next step is to actually validate our data. We're validating to make sure it's in the correct format and that it is the correct data itself. I always like to do this in kind of an interesting way. I like to create an errors array. You guys have created arrays before? Yeah, you see, that's the thing, though. I don't know if filter validate email is actually... Oh, validate. Yes, right. So it does not validate whether it's an email. It just removes illegal characters. That's interesting. It depends, because if you use filter var and you validate that it's an email, it actually does validate it's in the correct format. All right, let's go back to what we were talking about. So I'm going to create an array. I did see another student create an array in the other class, but they did it this way. Is that the way you guys learned? Or have you guys used arrays? You haven't created an array in PHP yet? You've done associative arrays. Technically, all arrays in PHP are associative arrays, but Yeah, so you can create just a basic array. The easiest way to do that is to just create a set of square brackets, and that automatically creates an array. The reason why we're doing this is because when the user goes to the page and they wind up incurring errors, because they've come to the server, the best thing to do is figure out all the errors that the user has and then tell them all at once. These are the things you need to fix, right? So then they can fix them all in one go and not have to go to the server, come back, go to the server, come back, go to the server, come back, right? So we want to avoid that, so we're going to give them all the errors at once. So the first thing we do, we create an empty array, and then for every error we get, we'll shove it into the array. So let's check and see if we have a an fname value. Now, the thing is, though, because the names come back as empty strings when they're not in there, so if I go back here and I'll show you what I mean. So we'll knock fname out and hit submit. Because it comes back as an empty string, this technically is not invalid. This is technically true. So what we want to do instead is check for empty. So if it's empty, then we want to push, array push, give errors, and then the value we want to push onto the errors array. So array push takes two arguments. It takes the array you want to push a value into, and then the value you want to add, right, as an item to the array. So first, name is required. Now that's one way to write it. The way I write it, though, the way I write pushes, I write them like this. So if empty, $LName, and I kind of like this format a little better. Errors, square brackets, equals, last name is required. So what happens is this means the exact same thing that this does. So I'm going to create two cursors. I'm going to hold down my Alt key and create another cursor here. Create two things. Pushing error onto the errors array. So that you know that these are both the same thing. They're identical. So we have a third check to do because we want to make sure that fname isn't empty, lname can't be empty, and email should not be empty either. So we'll make sure all three of those are not empty. There we go. So we can actually do a check now. Of course, it would help if we actually var dump the errors. So why don't we var dump the errors out? We'll var dump them at the very top instead of after those values. So there we go. We're var dumping our errors. Hit refresh. And as you can see, we only have one error currently. First name is required, and that's true because it is currently empty. So required is only one of the validations we have to do. So we validated that they are required and they need to be there. The next validation we should do is actually to check if the formats are in the correct formats, right? So we should check if email is in the correct format. And what I like to use for that is I use filter var. Filter var takes a variable, right? That you want to check against. So I'm going to check against email. And then the actual filter constant that you want to use as a pattern check. So this is going to be filter, validate, email. So once again, filter var, just like filter input, same kind of idea, but instead of taking an input, it takes an actual variable. And then it takes that variable and compares it to a pattern. And then under the hood, this gets pattern matched to make sure that it matches. So we want to make the opposite of this, right? Because if it matches, it's going to return true. We only care if it returns false, so we're going to add the not operator to reverse that condition. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you understand that if conditions only execute if they're true, right? So this is kind of a weird thing. That's why I like, that was one thing I liked in Ruby. Ruby had if and it also had unless. So that the way your code read made a little bit more sense, because when it was a negative thing you could use unless. It was kind of neat. Email needs to be in the correct format. There we go. And if I refresh, this should work right out of the box. Sure enough, email needs to be in the correct format, because if you look at our email address that we provided, it's just ASDF right now. And that is the incorrect format. So we also have to do the same thing with URL, but we have to remember that URL is not required. And we should also do the same thing with age, but you need to understand that age is not required, right? So age right now is passing as 42, but if I don't pass the age and I submit it, I get an empty age, which is fine. Let's see if we can... Now, I tried to do this earlier. We have to actually go to the form. And we have to modify it so that it isn't type number. We're going to use type text here. That way I can pass a non-text string here. So we'll just do ASDF, ASDF, ASDF. I want to try at ASDF and see if that passes. And I'm going to click submit. Yeah, so you were entirely right, eh? The email is not in the correct format when you don't include the top level domain, which is true to me. But for some reason it gets past the browser validation. So let's validate our age. The first thing we want to do is check to see that age is not empty and actually contains a value. Because if it doesn't contain a value, then we don't care. Right? We don't need to validate it if there's no value in there, because they're allowed to not have a value. And we want to validate that it's an integer, right? So again, we can use filter var for this. $age, filter, validate, int. Now we did find out that you can actually validate a range as well using this, but the syntax is quite tricky. It's like, it's a bunch of nested associative arrays, so it makes it a little tricky to validate that way. So instead, we'll just do this for now. Errors equals age must be an integer, like so. And then if we really want to also validate whether or not it's in the correct range, we'll just do it simply. We'll just say if age is greater than or equal to 18 and age is less than or equal to 130, right? Very simple. Then, sorry, we want to say if it's not. So if age is less than 18 or age is greater than 130. So if either of those things are true, meaning it's outside the range, then errors equals age must be in the range of 18 to 130. Alright, so if we refresh here, we get nothing. We should have got something, because age is not... Oh, age is empty. Did I screw up? I must have screwed up. ASDF, submit. You see? This is where things kind of help out sometimes. So the filter sanitize up here is actually taking care of the number, and it's saying, okay, well, you know, these letters are not a thing. So then it converts them into an actual integer. Yeah, so that totally works. So, yeah, you're right, actually. That's true. That is true. I don't think it'll pass either way because it doesn't matter because it's still not a thing. We've already checked. We don't actually need to do this at all. because we've already validated that it's a number. We did that up here. Actually, we didn't validate it's a number. We forced it to be a number, right? So if it's not a number, if it's an empty string, it's because the sanitization went through and sanitized out any non-numerical data. So that totally works. All we have to do then is check to see if it's empty. And if it's not empty, then we're good. All right, cool. So now we can come back here, change this to a number. So let's change this to a ridiculous number like 195.
Sean.
Oh, hello.
Hey, it's Andrew Morrison here.
Yeah.
Just right now you have age if not empty age, and you have an error message. Age must be an integer.
Oh yeah, you're right. No, that's entirely true. That's not good at all, actually. What we actually need to do is get rid of that, because it will automatically be an integer. There we go.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Because the sanitizer's already taken care of it. I mean, it doesn't give them the information that they need to know, because if they write ASDF as their age, or say they write 1, right? Because people do things like that, they'll write 1. If they write 1, then obviously when it comes through, we're not validating against that. It's going to wind up empty, and we're not really letting them know that it was empty, which is kind of a problem. So that is a little bit of a bad, that's bad logic, actually. That's not great logic. So 43A is going to be 43. I don't think so. I think if you add a number at the end of it, so if we did 43A like you suggested, it doesn't strip it out. Oh yeah, it did. Actually, it totally did. Good point. That's cool that the sanitizer removes it. But the sanitizer won't do things like, it won't convert that to the number 42, right? So that's where you run into problems. But you can actually avoid that by just simply making sure this is a number field and not a text field. And then that stops issues like that from happening. The user can't enter in ASDF here. So if a person posts 40-2 using Postman or Hopscotch or something like that, I don't care about that person. That person knows already what they're doing, and if they're doing that deliberately, that's their problem. That's just them being stupid. If a user types in 42 here, then they're usually an idiot, right? So they're typing in 42 because they're being an idiot, and they don't understand how the age thing works. So this kind of locks them into only being able to use numbers, so hopefully they'll only use a number. They physically can't submit anything other than a number in that scenario, unless they know how to shut off the validation, and then it's kind of like that scenario where if they're shutting off the validation, they already know what they're doing, and they're already being sneaky little jerks, so they deserve as little information as they get, as far as I'm concerned. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. Alright, the last one we need to check is the actual URL and make sure it's in the correct format. So, just like we did with email, really, if, well, first, actually, we have to make sure it's not empty. So, if not empty, $URL, because it needs to actually exist, and filter, sorry, not filter var, $URL, filter validate URL, like so. Then we can go ahead and add another error. URL must be in the correct format. There we go. So now if I type in ASDF here and hit submit, see, the URL must be in the correct format. But if I don't type anything into the ASDF and hit submit, I don't get an error, right? Because I shouldn't. But if I type the correct format, everything is good, and I can see it show up here. So that's good. We have filter, we have sanitize, we have validate. It's also important to understand that These are not the only validations you're ever going to write, right? Like checking to making sure that required fields exist is one validation. Checking and making sure that they're in the correct formats is another validation. You may be asking, why are we not checking lengths here? The database is going to handle some of that as well. Like when we go to shove these into the database, if for some reason they've exceeded the length that's required, the database will just reject it anyways, and we'll get an error back, and then we can actually utilize that error to kind of give back information on that. So we don't necessarily need that piece. However, the database does not validate email formats or URL formats. Actually, I think there might be a way to do that. I think you could use procedures to do that. But anyways, I digress. So this kind of covers most of the scenarios for us that we're going to cover. If you really want to get into covering lengths and that, you could in order to send back a nice message to the user. We're not going to do that. Just keep in mind that they're there. Other types of validations that we're going to cover as we go forward, though, in the course is, for example, when we start dealing with user authentication, we need to make sure that their username is unique, right? So we're going to definitely check in the database and make sure that the username is unique before we let them create this user. So that's a validation check that we're going to have to make. Same as their password. When they go to log in, we're going to need to validate that their password actually matches a password in the database and that they can actually logically log in, right? So those are other validation checks that we will need to be aware of. Validating, super important. So our last little bit here is called normalization. Normalization is basically taking data and converting it into a format that you want to shove into your database. That way you can expect all of the data in your database to be in the correct format, right? We're going to do something very simple. We're not going to get into anything super tricky. We're just going to basically format the first and last names so that they start with capital letters. So we're going to take fname equals, and there's two ways we can do this. One of the ways that people do it is with UC words, and then they do, is it to lowercase? No, what is it? String to lower, I think. I'm trying to remember the actual, string to lower, that's what it is. String to lower, and then you plug in fname. So what that does is this first operation will lowercase the string, and then this operation will uppercase any of the words in that string to uppercase letters, right? So if I save, I go back and I type in ASDF in lowercase letters, you can see that it's capitalized the ASDF, right? So that now it's a capital letter. However, PHP has a built-in function that already does this for us called MB convert case. You plug in the label, right, that you want, the variable that you want to modify, and then you give it the formatter string. So we're going to use MB case here. And if we refresh, we'll get the same value. And you might be like, okay, well, what's really the difference? Like, we're not saving any, anything on the length of the thing. Really, it's based on the fact that the other way you're executing two functions. This way you're only executing one. It would be a good idea to benchmark, though, and actually see which one of these two functions is, which one of these two algorithms is actually doing the quickest conversion for us. So now that we've got that, we can go ahead and Alt-Shift down, double-click fname, hit Control-D, and type in lname. And now we're controlling both of those values, which would help if we added ASDF here as well. And there we go. ASDF and ASDF. So that's validation, sanitization, and normalization. Any questions about any of that? So we're going to use this quite a bit going forward because obviously now that we know how to validate, sanitize, and normalize, any type of little examples that we're going to be building, we should be using sanitize, normalize, and validate, right? We should be definitely doing those going forward. So validation actually continues on even to when we start actually adding that information into the database. We can still kind of like enforce validation into those pieces. Sorry, not validation. What am I looking for? It's actually more like enforcing sanitization as we enter into our database. So one of our best things that we're doing is actually using PDO, because PDO is a fantastic way to kind of create secure SQL statements going in using bound parameters, right? PDO is fantastic all around, also because it gives you the ability to write once but connect to multiple databases. So it doesn't matter what database you're working with, this will always work with those other databases as well, because it allows multiple it allows you to connect to multiple database types, right? As long as they're all SQL based though. Or relational databases, I should say. It allows you to connect to multiple relational databases without having to rewrite all of your statements, right? That being said, though, keep in mind that SQL does change depending on the SQL database that you're working with. So the SQL statement may change, though, right? So, for example, using like inside Postgres does not work. In Postgres, it's I like. You have to use I like in order to get the same kind of wildcard matching. I'm not sure what it is in MS SQL, but it might be different as well. So just keep that in mind, that when you're working with other databases, sometimes your SQL statements will need to change. All right. So we're going to write a try catch, and we're going to perform some database stuff. I like to write it on one line and write everything I need in it, right? So it's going to throw an exception, if it throws anything at all. It's just a generic exception, and we'll store that in a variable called E. E. And then I'm going to take my cursor and I'm going to put it between these curly braces. I'm going to hold my Alt key and create a second cursor between the second set of curly braces and hit Enter to split those two apart. Remember that ID we were talking about before? The cool thing about using input post, and I love this thing. I've never seen it before reviewing Jessica's code. When I was looking through Jessica's code, that's the first time I had ever seen the filter input. I didn't even know that was a feature in PHP. So once I've seen that's awesome, because it allows you to actually filter out data pieces out of the post array, the post associative array, and if they don't exist, instead of it just throwing an error, it adds it in as a null value if it doesn't exist, or it adds it in as an empty string if it's incorrect. So I thought that was kind of neat. So we can use that to our advantage, actually. We can check to see if $ID is empty, because it actually returns null, right? So this is the value there. It returns null. And if it returns null, then what kind of database operation are we doing? So if there's no ID, are we updating or are we inserting? Yeah, exactly. We're inserting. So we can go ahead and write our SQL statement. We can say insert into contacts, and then we're going to need the column names and then values. Now what's cool, I don't know if you knew you could do this, you can actually split these across multiple lines, which makes it a little easier to read. So in this one we can write fname, lname, email, age, and URL. So they're across multiple lines, but it makes it a little bit easier to view. And then here we can put our bound parameters, if I can speak. And I'm going to be super lazy here. I'll show you something neat. I'm going to copy these. I'm going to paste them here. I'm going to bring my cursor to the left side of URL, and I'm going to hold down Control and Alt and press up to create 5 cursors, and then go bam. Now I have my bound parameters. So if there's no ID, right, then our SQL changes. it becomes an update statement. So update contacts set, and we can do these on separated lines as well. Fname equals fname, and then I'm just going to do that 5 times. And I'll show you something neat here as well. You can actually take these by holding Alt and double clicking. You can select them all and hit Control C, and then hold Alt down and do it to these bottom 4 and hit Control V, allowing you to do multiple paste. And then obviously we need our where statement as well. So where ID equals ID. Or I can just be a super nice person and share that big if else statement for you. So if there's no ID, we're inserting. If there is an ID, we're updating. We're updating. Cool. Cool. Now we're ready to actually prepare our SQL statement. So we'll create a variable called statement to hold the prepared statement in. We're going to access our DB. This variable, by the way, is coming from that connect script that we're including. We're going to prepare our SQL, right? And then we can go ahead and add all our bound params. So statement bind param. And we're going to do fname, right? $fname. Now what's cool is while we're here, we can also force that the data going into the database is in a particular data format. So we can actually say PDO param underscore string, and that will actually force the data to be a string. Yeah. Whoa, why does your SQL query have these nice colors? Yeah, mine shows same for whole, and that's horrible. Yeah. Nope. Prettier extension. I don't think I'm using Prettier. No, I'm not using Prettier, but I am using the PHP extensions. Hold on. I am using where is it? PHP debug and the PHP extension, as well as PHP IntelliSense. And I think one of those is actually creating the nice SQL. It's one of those 3. There's like so there's like extension packages where it's like a whole bunch of stuff. There's like a PHP one, and if you download it and install it, it will actually add all of those extensions for you. But then there's some configuration that you have to do, so you have to read the notes because you have to do some configuration. All right, so I have my statement bind param fname, and then I'm obviously going to need the lname one as well. So I'll just do Control D and do lname, and then email, Control D, email. And there's no like PDO param email. It's just strings. And then we need age as well. So that one's a little different. So it's age, and it's param. I can't remember if it's number int or just int. It's int. There we go. Int. And then I'm going to just duplicate one of these guys and bring them down using Alt. And then hit Control D and make that the URL. And then we can't forget to bind the ID as well, so we just need to check to see if it's empty. That's funny that we're checking to see if it's not empty. $ID. That works. $STMT, bind param, and we'll give it an ID, $ID, and that will be a param int. By the way, these are static properties on the PDO class. In case you were curious what that syntax is from. Now we're ready to execute. Statement, execute. And then I have a little piece of logic in here that's not in Jess's code, but is super handy. If $statement, meaning that if the statement returns an error, you have to actually look for it. We're going to throw a new exception, and we're going to pull the error info out. This is one of the weirdest things. Like, PDO seems to like stifle everything unless you're like, hey, do you have an error? Oh, yeah, an error happened. Okay, cool. Can I know what it is? Yeah, sure, here it is. It's like, it's so passive-aggressive. It's really annoying, but what it reminds me of is GPU programming. So GPU programming is kind of weird. It's like, you say, hey, okay, I want you to draw a triangle over here. Okay. Did you draw the triangle over there? Yep. You have to like ask it each time. Hey, so I told you to do this thing. Okay. Did you do the thing? Yep. Was there any errors? Yes. What are the errors? Like, you have to literally ask it each step so that you get all of the information you want. It's a wonder that video game programmers don't throw computers at windows. It really is. It's so frustrating. I mean, there are libraries that obviously make that much better and make it not as painful, but still. And then we're going to close our cursor. Though I'm not sure why. I mean, there's no real reason to close it. We're not doing any other queries, but we'll close it. And then it will actually auto close the second we exit our script. By the way, just so you're aware. We're going to redirect. Have you guys seen this before? This is a redirect, right? That's going to redirect the user from this process script to another page. Okay. And we're going to redirect them to the index page, and then we're going to nicely exit. Bye. See ya. Otherwise, in our catch statement, we should echo something out. So why don't we just echo out a really nice, pretty paragraph tag? Oh, it's so pretty. And we'll use the template literal or a interpolation string. Interpolated string, I should say. Get message. There we go. So that will error out our error message for us, or display our error message. We can make this pretty as well if you want by just adding a class to it. Don't forget to use single quotation marks. And we can say text alert, which will force it to come up in red. No, sorry, text danger. That's what it is. That will force it to come up in red. So if I refresh right now, we got shoved back to contacts. I'm not sure if it actually created anything. I just don't know. It definitely didn't throw an error. Oh yeah, it did. Yeah, it created something. So we should probably fix it so that we can actually go see whether or not it created anything. So I will copy this and I will put this into Postman for us. Like so. We'll give it PHP highlighting. Create the new paste. So there's the Postman for you, in case you were having difficulty following along. And I'm going to move over to the index page. And we'll add in the little bit of logic we need in order to make this work, so that we can see our stuff. So now I've noticed that you guys have done a lot of like SQL queries with PDO, but always doing prepare statements. Have you done any SQL queries without the prepare statement yet? Just so I know what to expect. Like using PDO though, not SQLi. I'm going to assume by your grand silence that that's the case. So let's create one. Select star from contacts. So we're going to select all our contacts. And then what we'll do is we'll actually store this in a row. Now the reason why we don't need to use a prepare statement is because we're kind of controlling this. We're not taking any information from the user. So we don't need to worry about them trying SQL injections because we're the ones writing the SQL. There's no bound params, so there's no reason to do a prepare. So what this statement does is it will query our SQL, right? So it will run this statement. That will return back a result set, and then we say, I want to fetch all. This is called chaining, when we chain multiple, multiple methods together. That's probably new, but it should be seem straightforward. So now if I refresh, I get nothing, but that's because, oh, sorry, I want to call this rows, not row. That's because we're not actually outputting anything on the screen, but you can var dump if you want to make sure that you're actually getting the data. And I am. I'm getting some nice data. So now our last step is to actually just create a for each loop and output this data in the table that you see here below. Not super difficult, kind of easy to do actually. We're just going to do it slightly different than you guys have done it in previous classes. I don't really like outputting strings of HTML. I much prefer to keep my HTML and my PHP separated. So I like to use the little shorthand tags that PHP provides to do that. So one way you would have originally done this is you would have written a PHP tag, right? And then you would write your for each loop here. Like so, right? In the old days, if we wanted to keep PHP and the HTML separate, we would have to actually close this tag and then open this tag, and then write our HTML in the middle. See how gross that is? That's so gross. And it was bad because you would forget what this was for, so you'd have to be like, closes the for each loop. You'd have to write like little messages to yourself just so you could remember what this silly curly brace was for, because you wouldn't know. And so things got better. What PHP did was they gave us these shorthand tags, which are kind of neat. I don't think they're actually called shorthand tags. I can't remember what they're called. But basically the way it works is you still write rows as row, but you end it with a colon. And then you can write another statement down here saying end for each. So you know exactly what this thing is doing. It's ending this thing. Now you can write your HTML in the middle. So we're going to have a TR tag, obviously. And we're going to have a TD tag. And we're going to have 5 of those. So I'm just hitting Alt-Shift to create 5 of them. Now I have my row, and I can go ahead and echo out my row. So again, shorthand tag, super handy. So we have PHP echo $row fname. So that should not seem new. That should seem fairly familiar, right? But because you would do this so much, this whole statement over and over again, PHP created a shorthand method which allows you to replace the PHP echo with an equal sign, and it means the same thing. So I want to write my full name here. And there we go. So now if I refresh, you can see it's ASDF, ASDF, but it's in these nice shorthand statements. I mean, you could write this as one statement as well if you wanted to. You would just have to do it like so. So now it's a string template, and it does the same thing. So whichever one you prefer that you think looks nicer, it's fine by me. Let's get the email, same thing. So just $row, email, and we'll do the same thing for age, $row, age, and then our personal page. Don't worry about actions. We're not going to write the delete or edit because they're getting kind of late in the night. And I'm already losing people. Boom. Oh, where's my email? I didn't get an email address. Wonder what happened there. Oh, there's not even one in the database. Never got added. I don't even know how that's possible because it's a not null field. Yeah, bugs are annoying. Bugs are super annoying. Here, I'll copy this and I'll give you this stuff. But I mean, I deal with bugs all the time, so it doesn't generally take me long to figure out where the bug is. Email param string, that's all correct. We're inserting, yep, that's all correct. We would have an email by this point unless it's empty. That's the only thing I can think of, is that the email address might be empty. So, what I like to do is just figure out where I'm at this point. So we'll dump the email and we'll exit the script. So I have ASDF at asdf.com at that point. So this email would still be the same. Binding the parameter, executing. All that's correct. So unless the email address is the problem, it worked that time. So I must have did something weird when I originally did email. I don't know what I did, but I must have done something. But yeah, it worked. And sometimes that happens. And if I look at the database, it's not even null. So that's how it passed. Somehow an empty string got shoved into it. Probably just from us duplicating and duplicating and duplicating things. And rerunning the code. Alright, so don't forget that you do have a quiz. And I pushed it up. Now, a student from the other class did point out that there's a small issue in one of the questions. In one of the questions, it asks you about session start, and it says it's okay for session start to not be at the top of the file. No, it says session start can go anywhere within the file, is what it says. And technically, that's true. Common convention is to put session start at the top of the file, right? So if you do have session start, it usually goes at the top of the file. That is common convention. The reason why that's common convention is because you don't want to wind up with a collision with headers. If you output any information to the page that results in a header getting sent, and then you call session start, it will blow up. Because you can't set the session before the headers have been sent. Right? Or sorry, after the headers have been sent. You have to set the session before the headers have been sent. So that's why it's common convention to do it at the very top of the file. In fact, it's also common convention to also clearly check and make sure that session hasn't already been started before you just start it. Okay? So Jess's answer to that question is false, because the session cannot be started anywhere within the file if you follow that convention. You need to start it at the top of the file. However, technically, the answer to that question is true, because you can literally put session start wherever you want, providing you're not outputting headers before it. Does that make sense? I know you guys did sessions last week. Yeah? Okay. We're going to do sessions again, not next week, but when we do the authentication lesson. We'll be doing sessions. And we'll see some magic around sessions and how sessions work. Cool. Any questions about any of the stuff that we learned tonight? About validation, sanitization, normalization? So don't forget that quiz. It's right there. Quiz 8. Quiz 8. Yeah, that's it. Sorry. I find it always weird. I always feel like I'm kind of saying it's it, but then I guess I have to like explicitly state, you can go now if you want to. That's it for the night. We are done.